I've come to the floor this afternoon to discuss legislation that I introduced this week with our colleagues Barbara Boxer, Patty Murray, and Kirsten Gillibrand. Our legislation responds to the rising cost of child care in the United States and the impact that it's having on millions of working families. Our bill, called the Helping Working Families Afford Child Care Act, would help these working parents. It would help them afford child care so that they can go to work and support their families. What it does is update the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit that was passed in 1976 and has only been updated once since that time. Access to affordable child care is a necessity for working parents. I raised 3 daughters. I have 7 grandchildren. So I appreciate just how important it is for working parents to know that their children are being supervised by quality caregivers. And sadly, I struggled with child care from the time my first child was born in 1974 until the year my last child finally went off to college in 2004. And unfortunately, I'm watching my daughters deal with that same struggle for how to find quality child care for their kids. A working parent can be productive in the workforce only when they know that their children are safe. That's why the rising cost of child care is a real burden for millions of families, especially for working mothers. Child care costs are taking up an increasingly larger share of a typical family's take-home pay. In New Hampshire, where I visited a great NAEYC accredited child care center in Nashua earlier this week, and I saw their infant room where they care for infants. The average cost for care for an infant in New Hampshire in full-time care in a child care center was almost $12,000 in 2012, the last year we have data for. $12,000. For a family trying to make ends meet, this is a huge cost. And in fact, in the Northeast, the cost of full-time, center-based care for children now represents the highest single expense for a typical household, more than housing, more than college tuition, more than transportation, food, utilities, or health care. And unfortunately, as the cost of child care has grown, one critical tax credit that helps defray child care costs has failed to keep pace: the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. That was first enacted in 1976 with strong bipartisan support, supported by both Democrats and Republicans. This credit provides a tax credit to working parents for a portion of their child care expenses. However, the limits on the credit are not indexed to inflation, and so their value is actually decreased over time. And in fact, the limits have been increased just once in the past 25 years. The tax credit simply is not keeping pace with the growing costs of child care. The Helping Working Families Afford Child Care Act would update and improve this tax credit so that it responds to the increasing burden of child care costs. First, the bill would increase the amount of child care expenses that are eligible for the credit. Right now, families can only claim expenses up to $3,000 for one child and $6,000 for 2 or more children. Now, that just doesn't make sense in New Hampshire or anywhere else in the country. But in New Hampshire, the average cost of child care can exceed $11,000 for a single child. This bill increases the tax credit starting in 2015 and indexes the costs to inflation so that they will continue to keep pace with rising child care costs. The bill also makes the tax credit fully refundable and phases out the credit for families making over $200,000 a year. So it better targets how the money is spent. Right now, the tax credit is poorly targeted. It provides zero benefit for too many families who need it the most. By making the credit refundable, the bill better targets the tax credit to families who are most in need of child care assistance. Now, Madam President, I've been working on early child care and education for most of my public career, especially during my years as governor of New Hampshire. And one of the lessons that I've learned is that providing access to affordable early childhood care and education is not just about helping families make ends meet. That's an important piece of it. But it's also a short-term and a long-term issue for our businesses and our economy. As governor, I worked with the New Hampshire business community and established the Governor's Business Commission on Child Care and Early Childhood Education to engage business leaders in addressing the state's child care and early education needs. We did a study that looked at the impact of the shortage of quality child care in New Hampshire back in the 90s. And we found that businesses were losing up to $24 million a year as a result of child care-related absenteeism, and that nearly 1 in 4 employees were forced to change jobs or switch to part-time as a result of their inability to find satisfactory child care. We have many national studies that show that quality, dependable child care for employees is vital to a company's productivity. And in fact, researchers estimate that child care breakdowns leading to employee absences cost businesses $3 billion a year. $3 billion, because parents are concerned about where their kids are. In addition, a majority of companies report that employee absenteeism is reduced when quality child care services are offered. Employee turnover is also reduced. And we know just how important employee retention is to a business's bottom line. So the long-term benefits to our workforce are also clear. Research shows that quality child care and early childhood development are critical to preparing our children for tomorrow's jobs. We know that the first 5 years are the most critical in the development of a child's brain. During these years, children develop their cognitive, social, emotional, and language skills that form a solid foundation for their lives. Research shows that children who receive quality child care do much better in school. They're less likely to drop out. They're more likely to learn to read at grade level. They're less likely to repeat grades. They're less likely to need special education. And they're less likely to get into trouble. The experiences children have in their first few years will affect them, their families, and our society for the rest of their lives. So I think it makes more sense for us to invest in early childhood care and education, because we can either spend the money then, or we can spend a whole lot more money when kids don't get a good start in life and they wind up getting into trouble and wind up getting into prison. I used to talk about the cost of early care and education as being about $1 for every $7 that gets spent at the other end if we don't pay for these costs. It's a whole lot cheaper to pay for child care than it is to pay for prison. So that's why we've got to respond to the rising cost of child care. We've got to ensure that working families can afford quality child care. The legislation we introduced this week will help working families in the short term. It will especially help working mothers as they go to work, but it will support the early development of our children, which is so critical to our future, to our economy, to our workforce. I'm hopeful that we can get a lot of sponsors for this legislation. We can get bipartisan support, just as the credit had when it passed in 1976, and we can provide the help that working families need.